we're rolling. Welcome to LogRocket. I'm Brian. That's Chris. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Brian?
I am very well this morning, which we are recording in the morning. I've been yelled at before for giving that away, but I don't think really anyone cares. Everyone who's listening to this probably knows who I am at this point, but maybe they don't know who you are. So please introduce yourself. You can do a better job than I can.
Yeah, I'm doubtful. But So hi, everyone. I am Chris Ferdinandi, and I help people learn vanilla JavaScript. So my whole kind of focus, or kind of the thing I evangelize constantly, is that there's maybe a simpler and more resilient way to build things for the web.
And you have a lot of stuff, I guess is the easiest way to say it. Like, you're working on a lot of things. You did a great job explaining it concisely. I'm interested in kind of like give us the whole thing. Like, what's the suite of projects, I suppose?
Yeah. I have a lot going on. So the thing I think most people know me for, every weekday I publish a short email newsletter over at gomakethings.com, where I share just kind of random tips, tricks, ideas, cool stuff I've found from around the web. These are the kinds of things you can just easily consume while having your morning coffee. I also have a suite of ebooks and courses over at vanillajsguides.com, and an online, I call it semi-asynchronous project-based workshop, Vanilla JavaScript Academy at vanillajs.com, where we spend a handful of weeks together building cool projects and really just kind of learning how to solve problems with code.
I want to get back to, I'm going to start with the first thing you said, but the asynchronous learning is interesting also.
Yeah.
So the weekly kind of newsletter, am I thinking of it right?
Yeah. So it's every weekday. So 5 days a week.
Oh my God.
It's so you would think it's a lot, and it kind of is, but I found it's an easier cadence to keep up than once a week or once a month, just because it becomes a habit and you become really efficient at writing when you write every weekday. These are not long form essays most of the time. Every now and then they are. Like, you'll get on a tear about something and I'll just sit down for an hour and like crank out like a short story. But for the most part, it's, if you imagine something that might be like a big in-depth article and you break it up into a few small parts over a couple of days, that's usually the length. I was pushed by actually a couple of folks I know who run their own small businesses to try doing the daily writing. And I was really, really hesitant, in large part because I thought no one would want to read my thoughts that frequently. But I think the really interesting shift that happens is because everything necessarily becomes a lot shorter, because you just can't keep up a volume if it doesn't. People like it better. It's easier to read. It's not the kind of thing that comes in and then you're like, oh, I'll set this aside till when I get back to it later. Like, you can read it in just a couple minutes. People seem to retain the stuff in it a lot better because it's shorter. Like, you're not trying to cram as much stuff, into your brain in one sitting. And I tend to get a lot of questions. Like, if I'm writing a series of articles, I'll get a lot of questions early on, which help me clarify the things I'm explaining later. So it's a really nice kind of back and forth. Like, I get a lot out of it as someone who teaches people because I get a lot of questions, a lot of feedback, and that helps me do what I do better.
Do you remember when you first, so you were talking to small business owners and they kind of inspired you to write regularly or daily, really? Do you remember like when you first started, were you terrified? Like,
yes, very much so.
And even now, like, how do you, because I'm sure, the reason I'm asking is I'm sure other people are kind of in the same place. Is like, they're thinking, should I start a newsletter? Should I not? And how am I going to come up with things to write about to this particular community? Yeah.
So just to name names. So Jonathan Stark over at jonathenstark.com and Philip Morgan at philipmorganconsulting.com were the two folks who really encouraged me to do this. Jonathan was my business coach at the time. And Philip was just I shouldn't say just, he's a friend. So they had, for like weeks, maybe months, been pushing me to switch my newsletter, which was at 38 subscribers at that point, to daily. And I'm like, look, man, there's just no way I can keep up that cadence. I can't come up with that many ideas. This will not work. And they're like, just try it for like a month, 2 weeks. If you hate it, you can always switch back. Like, you only have 38 subscribers. Who cares? It's not like you really have anything to lose, you know? They were a lot nicer about it than I just described it. So I was like, all right, if I can come up with a month of ideas in 10 minutes, I'll give it a go. And so I just sat down with a piece of paper, started a timer on my phone, and jotted down a list. And I think I came up with like 25 or 28. It was like, it wasn't quite a month, but it was close enough. And like, it was really, really simple things like how to get an element by class in the DOM, you know, or how to add or remove a class from an element. Like, not like everything you ever wanted to know DOM manipulation, like just really short, focused kind of stuff. And really weird thing happened. So I started writing. I did it for a week. In that week, my list that had been stuck at 38 subscribers for like 2 months doubled to 60. 70, something like that. It doubled. I'm bad at math. 70. There we go. And I lost a few folks, but I gained some new folks, and I started getting questions back like, oh, this is cool. I don't understand this part. Can you explain it more? And so it, by the end of the month, I had started a to-do list of article ideas as they came to me, because I started getting questions back. And instead of ending with 0 when I was done with my 28 kind of original items, I now had a list of 50 topics because people kept writing back with questions. And so I've heard it described as this, it's like a flywheel effect where once it starts moving, it kind of like propels itself a little bit. And so the entire rest of my business exists because Philip and Jonathan convinced me to write every weekday. Because these questions started to like, I'd noticed trends. So then I started like putting together some short guides around like broader topics. So I'd like take some of my newsletters, clean them up a little bit, mash them up into a book. Then I started having people say, hey, I learned better with video. Can you make some video courses? So then I made video versions of the books. And then people finished all the books and they're like, I have memorized all of these methods and I know exactly how to use them. But when I sit down to start a project, I have no idea how to get going. Can you help me with that? And that led to like a whole workshop that was focused on building projects. And yeah, it's been this really weird organic thing that all starts with the newsletter decision. And at this point, I have a list of about 100 article ideas, and I know half of them I'll just never get to. Like, sure. I will die before I get to write them.
Well, you're probably, I mean, you know, if you have an idea wherever it is you are doing, you're either writing it in your phone or, you know, scratching it on pieces of paper, like that would be, and then it just goes into your note-taking app of choice.
Yep.
I mean, I'm speaking from experience, you know, like we, the LogRocket content, it's a different animal, but there's a really kind of linear relationship between traffic and regular posting cadence.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think sometimes, you know, people who are first starting out or considering going into business for themselves, doing this, you know, teaching JavaScript, being an instructor, the business side or the marketing side is maybe like, I don't want to say foreign, but it's not something that's not something that you were doing before, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I asked the question. And also
it's a little terrifying, to be honest. It was for a long time one of my my biggest hesitancies about doing this. And everybody's kind of mileage will vary, but I will say the thing that really helped me kind of get comfortable with it was, first of all, you don't have to do everything. I think there's kind of this, when you start off, there's this perspective that like, okay, I'm marketing. I need to run ads. I need to, you know, just all these things. And what I found is if you pick a couple of things that you're comfortable with that work well for you, you don't have to do all the things. So like for me, it's stuff like, Brian, what you and I are doing now, just chatting. Like I can talk all day long. It's like what I'm very chatty. So this is super easy and fun. And then the newsletter, and I don't really do any other marketing beyond these two things. I choose these two things because I enjoy them. I know a lot of folks really enjoy like conference talks and meetups. I get like kind of anxious in large social situations, even pre-COVID. And so, for me, that's just not really my favorite type of marketing. So I don't really do much of it. And I think, for folks who are listening, who are kind of thinking about this, do not feel like you have to do everything. And then I think the other piece here is I always, before kind of having my own business, thought of marketing as kind of this icky thing. And I think the reason I felt that way is because it often is. But again, it doesn't have to be.
Like, as a marketer, sorry to interrupt. As a marketer, yeah, I agree. Yeah. It can be kind of icky.
Like just because most of your experiences with marketing are like shady marketers pushing like crap products on people who don't need them, like you don't have to do that. And so like one of the things I do is like sometimes I'll just go on Twitter and search for JavaScript, and then if people have questions, I'll answer them. And like, if I have an article about it, I'll link to it. If I don't, I'll write one and link to it. That's technically marketing, but it's really just me like helping people with their problems.
100%. Like I think all of those things I agree with, and I think we've done. And it's like, there's, first of all, that the whole message resonates with the audience. And I could say that after like 4+ years of doing this, that like in a lot of ways, less is more. Like but maybe more importantly, provide value, which is an annoying thing to say. Like, give people stuff they would actually use and like, but you don't really have to do much else. Like a lot of it does happen organically. So if like you're feeling really overwhelmed, like, should I think about Twitter ads? And I mean, I've seen them and maybe, but I don't know. I think the easiest way to do it is like get people to like you and trust. And the way you do that is like, I do the same thing. Like if someone has a question about, a blog post that we put out, and, it's not that hard to just follow Twitter and answer personally and be like, this is the author who wrote it. Here's what happened. Or if we screwed up, which I talk about maybe too often, like if we screw up and someone comes back and it's like, oh, we messed up. That's a bummer, but thank you for pointing it out. Like, how do we work that? And then almost everyone comes back and it's like, oh, no problem. Like I love the blog and that's what happened. Like, it's really rare that anything kind of negative happens. And anyway, going back to the point, there is kind of you're not always guaranteed that like, if you build it, they will come, but kind of.
One other thing, you kind of mentioned the like help people and like give them things they need. One thing I don't talk about as often as I should, but so I have anybody who buys my stuff gets access to like a Slack community that I have set up. And, if I were doing it today, it might end up being Discord, but same idea, just like a chat space. You could even do like an old school internet forum if that's more your speed. But it was originally like a nice value add for folks. Like, hey, if you have questions about what you're learning here, you have a direct line of contact. Like we can chat. I can answer your questions. And so that was kind of helpful. But it's become this place now where anytime I'm unsure what to do with my business, I have like literally a group of customers who are hanging out, waiting to talk to me, and I can ask them questions and get immediate responses and like gut check things. Like, and I'd never be like, hey, should I run Twitter ads? But I might say something like, hey, when you're not here, where do you hang out to learn more about front-end development or whatever the topic happens to be? And they'll be like, oh, maybe it is Twitter. Maybe it's some other place. Maybe there's another community. Maybe there's a podcast they listen to all the time that, would be a great place for me to like run an ad or something like that. Just like having built, it's such a cliche at this point, but building a community is a really powerful thing, especially if you're like a business of one or like a smaller kind of company or organization.
I think we're hitting all of the important cliches early on in this episode, because what did I say?
Yeah, I forgot my bingo card, but
somebody is like, okay, Brian said, provide value. If you build it, they will come, which is, I'm not even sure half the audience will understand what I'm talking about. And then of course, build a community. But I mean, in a lot of ways, like we're not lying. I mean, it does work. It's funny, like when we were thinking about starting this podcast, for example, we would ask our own engineers, like the same thing kind of you would ask that Slack community, like where do you guys hang? Well, so I would ask, what kind of podcast do you like? And I got or do you listen to? And I got like zero helpful answers. It was all like, I really love 18th century history podcasts. And I'm like, cool, man, but this does not help me at all. I mean, I believe you. But in general, like, I think that those discords or those like private Slack communities, because like now I'm starting to see them tiered. Like you've got the free ones that if you're really lucky or if it's a really popular community, there's like 50,000 people in this, and it becomes just totally unmanageable, even if you have moderators. And then you have kind of like the paid version, which, like, let's say if you're on Substack, for like $15 a month, and that's like 5,000 people, and that's better. But yeah, it's still requires a lot of, like, that's a whole job in and of itself, and that's not really what, like, you didn't sign up. Like the whole point wasn't to be a community moderator,
Yeah. My having a community that's too big has always been my fear. It sometimes feels a little bit like people tend to worry about scale when they're like just building a project that has no customers yet, and it's important to think about, but it's probably too early to worry about. I've been at this for like 5 or 6 years now, and I still haven't hit like a community size where I'm like, okay, this is like drinking from a fire hose. This doesn't really work anymore. I also really strongly believe that you get the community you deserve. And so some of the worst communities I've been in have almost no presence from like the person who started it, or like there's no like expectation setting, or like like norm modeling, for lack of a better word. Like I have a code of conduct that people have to agree to, and I am very, very strict about both pointing out when people deviate from it, or like booting people entirely and refunding them for anything they've purchased, if it's like either too egregious or like just kind of a recurring issue. And a lot of times, like, people do things that like they just don't realize like they're coming across a certain way, or like like, I just, as an example, like around diversity topics, a lot of folks who like, I have students who they're white, they're male, maybe they grow up in an area where they are not really exposed to a diverse audience, and they'll use phrases or say things that they don't, and I'm not like, not racial slurs or anything like that, but they may say something that they don't realize is like problematic. And my community has gotten really good about like pointing those things out for me if I don't see it, in large part because I made a very strong like point of modeling the kind of behavior I wanted to see early on. I've been in other community, and I don't have a moderator. I did for a while. Now it's just me, and we have, I think there's like 6,000 people in the Slack. Although, to be fair, on any given week, only about like 100 to 300 of them are actually active. But I've been in Slacks like you've described, or communities like you've described, where there's just thousands of people firing questions into the void and no one ever responds to any of them.
Well, that's the hard part is like, there, once you get that big, there's a lot of people asking, and not like it's not really practical for that many people to give. Yeah. I don't think. I'm sure that there's a book on this somewhere, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it feels like one of those things, like, growing a community is actually harder than it sounds like it would be. So I worried about it for a while, and then I realized it's just not a problem I expect to have for a while. But I feel like I'll start to get a sense for when it's happening, and I don't really have a plan for how to deal with it yet. But it is definitely something that's kind of like always in the back of my mind a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, are you ready for another cliche? I think it's there's an aspect of kind of building in public. There it is. To that, or I don't know what's going to happen to this, and as long as people are here for the right reasons and are behaving themselves, then sure, then it should go pretty well. And it seems like it is for you.
Yeah. Nice. So far.
Well, that's all really any of us can ask. Okay, so let's pivot from business stuff, and I want to move a little bit to kind of what is it that um, people should know about, like, what are the things. So you're the the vanilla JavaScript guy. That's how I would think about it. Is that accurate? And are
Yeah, well,
those
that's
the
how I describe myself. I didn't coin the term. I didn't make the joke website, but I do spend an absurd amount of time evangelizing it. So, yeah, I
okay?
think that's accurate.
So
I've heard other people refer to me as that, and so I was like, oh, I like that. I'll go with that. That works.
um, all right. So maybe there are two parts, right? Like, give us
Mhm.
the quick, because for someone who's not familiar, like, why
Sure.
why is it so exciting? And then I guess the second part of the question is, like, right now, like, what are the things that you're kind of excited about,
Yeah.
or at least interested in? And there, sometimes those can be different.
Yeah, sure. So at a super high level. So if you've never heard the term vanilla JavaScript before, it's just a phrase that means platform native or like baked into the browser JavaScript, APIs, methods, things like that. And I know a lot of folks who hate the term because they're like, that's just JavaScript. And they're right. But these days, when you search for how to do X with JavaScript, you end up getting a ton of like React, jQuery, underscore, Angular, Vue kind of solutions. And vanilla JavaScript kind of became this nice little shorthand for filtering out all that stuff. Like you could do Boolean searches that say ignore all these phrases, but that's like a unending task to keep up with them all. So just tacking vanilla JavaScript or vanilla JS onto a search like cuts most of that stuff out. And it started off as a joke. Someone made this website, vanilla-js.com, that positions it as like this hot new framework used by all the other frameworks.
Yeah.
But the writing is so dry and so like serious that if you're not versed in New England style sarcasm, it probably doesn't like I picked up on it because like that's the way my friends and I talk to each other all the
Right.
time.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of beginners who are like, I installed the file from the CDN, but nothing's loading, and this doesn't seem to be working. Like, what's going on? And so, um, uh, yeah, I spend a small amount of time every now and then, like seeing these like tweets on Twitter and like trying to like explain to people what's actually going on. But so I that's a tangent. I digress. The reason I got into this in the first place is I learned JavaScript through jQuery, and at the time I was really like digging into web performance. And Dave Rupert, um, a developer out in Texas, had written this whole thing about how he dropped jQuery for browser native JavaScript and like shaved several seconds off like the start render time and load time on his site. And part of that was because WordPress loves to load jQuery in the header and do all sorts of like render blocking terribleness. But part of it was he stripped out a bunch of abstractions, and the site started to run faster. So I started digging into this. And since then, a lot has changed. Browsers pulled in a ton of features inspired by jQuery. So things that used to be really hard are now really, really easy with just like what's baked into the browser. And then we started to see the rise of frameworks. And so for a handful of years now, I've spent a lot of time talking about how these tools are awesome for a very specific group of things for which they were built. And they're absolutely terrible for both developers and the people who use the things they build for a whole large set of other things. And my big argument is that we overuse a lot of the big libraries that are most popular today, and we use them for applications for which they're not the best choice.
What's your hypothesis for why?
Yeah. So I think there's a few things kind of going on here. Uh, just generally as an industry, I see a few kind of things. I see this move in cycles. Um, uh, One of them is I think there's a little bit of like if it's good enough for like Facebook or Twitter, it's good enough for me kind of thing. Like, well, Facebook uses React, so it must be, look at all the amazing things they build. So like it must be great for me too. And Facebook has a whole suite of engineering problems that maybe don't necessarily apply to the thing that you're building. The other, I think, piece here is there's a little bit of like marketing going on. So people who build new things go out to conferences and show, podcasts and talk about them. And then if they get enough hype, our industry seems to be, especially front end engineers, get really, really fickle and love to jump to like the new exciting thing because and I speak as a front end engineer myself, like we love to learn new things and play around with cool new shiny toys and stuff. And so I've noticed with like things like Angular and Vue and React, there's been kind of this thing now where you get a bunch of developers excited about these tools, and then companies are like, oh, if we want to hire the best engineers, we need to use the tools that they're really excited to work with. So you start seeing job descriptions looking for these tools. And then companies are like, oh, my competitor over there is using this tool. We need to make sure we're using it too so that we can compete for developers. And then before you know it, a whole industry is using a small set of tools because of kind of this hype cycle. And it's not that React and Vue and Angular are bad. They are very, very good at the things they were specifically built to do. State-based UI in a very complex DOM-heavy environment. But most of what we build is not nearly as complex as these tools require. And if you look at a lot of the HTML that kind of gets spit out in something like Facebook or React, Facebook or Twitter, there's a reason why like a virtual DOM heavy library probably gives them better performance and makes it easier to work with. They have like a bunch of different engineering teams working on a subset of products that all get cobbled into one UI. A lot of the things that we build don't require that. And then the other angle here too is like, I know a lot of agencies use these tools. And I think the thing that happens there is if you're going to take the time to invest in kind of training your staff on a particular tool set, and you build a bunch of kind of like tooling around that, things you maybe use on a lot of projects you work on for clients, it makes sense to keep using that over and over again because you're incentivized to build things as quickly as possible, for your clients. And you want to get a good ROI on this tooling that you've built. So I think there's a whole bunch of issues that kind of happen here. And then I could ramble on and on about this, but I think there's also a bit of a false narrative around the developer experience, which is not to say the developer experience isn't important. It really, really is. But I hear this perspective all the time that these tools make it easier for developers to build things. And because that is true, we can focus on building all these great features for our clients and our customers or users. And kind of that experience that we gets passed on to the users. And I would argue that the developer experience isn't actually better for at least a not insignificant subset of people who work on the front end, and that it rarely gets passed along to the users as a net win for them. In fact, I think often the opposite is true. And I can come up with some very specific counter arguments for when it actually has made the user experience better. So I can argue with myself here on this one if you'd like me to.
No, you're not alone. I mean, I feel like that happens. Hey, I definitely have said before, it's what keeps me personally in business. It's like those kinds of, there's actually no real answer for this, but if you present these two sides and I mean, I have in doing, prep for this episode, I started thinking about like, the big three frameworks or the big four, because we left out Svelte, which maybe we shouldn't. And I was like, maybe we should. I'm sure someone else has already thought about this, like vanilla JavaScript as the fifth. And maybe that's more appealing if you don't necessarily want to use. I don't really know the best way to put it. A library that comes from a large tech company with baggage. Right. That's
a very diplomatic way to phrase
it. How about
that?
So I mean, that seems like a plus to me. If you, I'm going to get so much. Well, I probably won't. I mean, how could you not? Point. I mean,
and I actually didn't bring up Svelte for a very specific reason, because I see Svelte and New Kid on the Block, Astro, and static site generators. I see them as kind of a different category. For me, they're actually one of the things I'm most excited about for like what's coming next. They're, in my mind, kind of the they're a good leap forward, I think is a right way to describe it. Not perfect, but I think potentially a good leap forward. And we can talk about that if you'd like.
I would very much like to. Let's pull on that thread.
Yeah. So the thing that, just at a super high level, like the 1 or 2 liner on this, is that I think the problem with a lot of the modern client-side libraries that we use is not only are they big, there are a lot of JavaScript that gets sent to the user, and that has a bunch of performance implications just because of how JavaScript is downloaded, compiled, and parsed compared to, say, CSS or HTML or image files. But JavaScript is also really, really fragile. It's way more prone to breaking than HTML and CSS are. If the browser doesn't understand something in your HTML or CSS, it just kind of ignores it and moves on. But with JavaScript, it's like, nope, this whole file's garbage. Just like toss it out. We're done here.
Yeah.
And so there's this new set of tools that I'm really excited to start seeing more of. And I kind of put them in maybe 2 categories. So the first is micro libraries. So I'm starting to see more front-end tools that mimic the approaches of bigger tools like Vue or React, but do it with a much smaller footprint, maybe shed a few of the features that are like nice to haves, or like, hey, Facebook needs that. Most people don't. And they end up with something that's both smaller and faster. And I think the shining example here is probably Preact, which is 1/10 the size of React, uses the same API, including React hooks. It's literally like 3 kilobytes, which is absolutely amazing after minifying and gzipping. And not only is it a smaller package, but because it has fewer abstractions baked into it, it actually not just renders faster, but responds to data changes. Its reactivity engine is faster as well by quite a bit. It's about 4 times faster than React in terms of implementing UI updates when state change. And I can, if you want an article on that for the show notes, I have some research that was done, some data I can share with you to link to. So that's kind of one bucket. So you've got Preact. Evan You, the guy who built Vue, recently released something called Petite Vue, which is a small subset of Vue that's really intended for more of the progressive enhancement type stuff that is a very common use case for Vue and doesn't require the full 30 kilobyte package. And he was inspired by another project called Alpine that kind of mimicked Vue's approach, but in a smaller library, a little bit closer to the metal. So micro libraries, they're really cool, but they still have some of the problems in my mind that these older libraries do, which is that they're shipping a bunch of abstractions and they're effectively putting kind of the rendering and runtime in the browser for stuff that in a more classical architecture used to happen on the server. Back in the day when everything was like PHP driven or like .NET. And so I think the other category that I find even more exciting, I just broadly refer to them as pre-compilers, and it covers a wide suite of things. So on one hand, you've got stuff like Svelte, which is really, really neat. So for those of you who don't know, Svelte allows you to create views the same way you might in something akin to React or Vue. It's a little bit different, but you've got the same kind of basic concept where you've got a component and some state, and you specify some things that kind of happen when the state changes. And then instead of that being the thing you ship, you compile these .svelte files into the thing that actually ships. And what Svelte does is it takes all that code and it spits out mostly HTML, mostly pre-rendered, with a little bit of honestly like old school DOM manipulation style vanilla JavaScript, the kind that you might hand code if you were still doing things that way. And so it gives you the authoring experience of working with a library, but gives the user something that's going to be a lot more resilient and way more performant. They're currently working on a new tool called SvelteKit that adds routing and adds some really interesting progressive enhancement features. So that's really neat. And then there's New Kid on the Block. I always forget if it's called Astro or Atomic. Please give me a minute. I want to say it's called Atomic. There are two of them. Astro. Okay, it is Astro is the one I'm thinking of. Here we go. And I apologize. So it literally just came out, like, as far as I know, a couple of weeks ago. So Astro is really neat. It takes the concept that Svelte had and takes it to the next level and says, hey, so what if instead of having to use like our own syntax here, you could use anything you want? So with Astro, you could take a card component from Vue and a tab component from React and some Svelte file you started working on and mash them all together in one project and compile it into mostly HTML with a little bit of JavaScript. And it's going to strip out all of the libraries that you put in there and like output the things that they're actually doing into close to browser native JavaScript. So it gives you, like, if you're a team that really enjoys that authoring experience, like let's say you're already all in on React, you can still use React and give your users a more resilient and performant experience by layering Astro on top. Jason Lengstorff from Netlify played around with this just a couple weeks ago. He took this next.js site that he had, ported it over to Astro, used 90% of the same component code, and ended up spitting out something that had 90% less client-side JavaScript and a page load time that was 30% faster than it was before. So really just like big wins all around with almost no additional work or overhead. So I really like tools like that. And then on the other kind of end of the spectrum, there's still technically pre-compilers, but the authoring experience is very different. Static site generators. So you've got things like Hugo, Jekyll. I used to call them New Kid on the Block 11T, but 11T's been around for a while now and they're doing great things. They just hit version 1, which is awesome. Yeah, those are really, really powerful too. And I think for me, the thing that I'm most excited about is tools that allow developers to work in a flexible way that fits their needs, but doesn't make the end user of the thing that they've built pay for that convenience. That's always been my problem with a lot of these bigger libraries is, I'm getting a benefit allegedly as a developer, and I'm passing that cost on to my user.
Literally pay or trade-off?
Figuratively pay in the sense of, slower load times, potential crashes on older devices and lower bandwidth kind of situations. Not in the monetary sense, but in the user experience kind of sense. So I gain something as a developer. It costs you something as the person who uses what I built.
Yeah, it might. I mean, what I was fishing for maybe was like there are literal costs.
No, you're right.
If you mess up, like if you're going to have to pay for a lot of different things.
Well, I actually didn't even. You're saying it made me think about for a lot of people who are on like limited bandwidth kind of data plans and things like that, there is a literal cost for shipping all this JavaScript. Not even getting into like, if you want to get really heady about it, you could make I think a really valid argument about the environmental cost of just shipping that much code, like storing it, sending it down the wire, the amount of electricity devices use to process and run it. Like, it's just turtles all the way down.
Yeah, it's a turtle. Yeah, no, people do that all the time with crypto, and in my opinion, justifiably so. So yeah, no, I'm not going down a crypto rabbit hole. Believe me, I'm not there yet.
You really want to get angry emails, though, Brian?
No, I don't. Believe me, which I really don't. So one thing I was thinking is we started by saying like, hey, should we consider Svelte Big 4? And you said, I consider that part of a new wave. Do I have that right? So we talked about what that new wave was. the precompilers, and then smaller libraries. And to me, all of that still sounds pretty complex.
Yes. So there's another,
yeah.
I think it's a longer term play. But one of the things I've noticed is, and I am by no means, I actually probably didn't even notice this. I probably had someone point it out to me and now I can't unsee it. And I've got a little bit of a, like, I built this kind of thing going on.
Yeah.
But, the industry moves in circles. And what often happens, because the standards process is necessarily slow, you have a bunch of stuff people want to do that the platform doesn't support yet, but that could be bolted on through tooling. And so people build a bunch of tools to make the things that they want to do work in like a reasonable way in the browser. And then eventually, sometime down the road, the browser catches up. And then there's a really slow kind of petering off of the tooling as more people realize they don't need it anymore. And the most recent example of this, I shouldn't say most recent, but I think the shiniest example of this is jQuery. So if you're not old and gray in the beard like I am, you may not remember the web before jQuery and how absolutely abysmal it was to try and write JavaScript for that web, where Internet Explorer and Firefox and like Netscape, they all did things their own way and didn't care what the other one was doing. So you'd have code that was littered with a bunch of if-else kind of statements. So, if the browser supports this method, use it. If not, use this other one. You couldn't get an element in the UI by class unless you got all of the elements by a specific like tag name and then looped through all of them to check if they had a class on them using some complicated regex thing. Like it was a pain. And then jQuery came around and was like, hey, we've abstracted all that stuff away for you. Use these methods instead. They're really well documented, by the way. Let's, now you can write it once, it'll work everywhere. And that was just like a revelation. And then years later, we got ES5, which took many of these conventions from jQuery and baked them right into the platform. So we got Query Selector and Query Selector All that let you find elements in the UI by any CSS selector. We got the class list API, so you could add and remove stuff really easily. We got better methods for looping over arrays and making changes to them. It just got really, really good. And so I see what's happening now with all of this tooling as kind of another, I don't know if you'd call this the crest or the trough. I guess it really depends on how you look at it in terms of the wave of development. We're either at like the high or the low. But
I understand.
What I'm envisioning is that more and more of the stuff that libraries do is going to get absorbed into the platform as time goes on. It's a very slow process, and the things they're doing are way more complicated than what jQuery was doing back in the day. So I think it'll be kind of a slower process to figure out what that really looks like. But what most of these tools do, in my perspective, is pave cow paths, kind of show the way things could be. It allows developers to like kind of in the wild experiment with some ideas and then be like, this works, this doesn't, this is a better way. And then hopefully the best stuff kind of floats to the top and gets pulled into the platform. So I would love, for example, to see some sort of native DOM diffing. Like that's like really at the heart of what a lot of these libraries do, is like, here's how the UI looks, here's how it should looks, make them the same with as little like effort as possible. And I would love some sort of browser native way to do that. Maybe with HTML strings, because template literals are awesome. And it would be really cool to get like a JSX like kind of experience right in the browser. One of the things that's in the works that a lot of libraries do is sanitizing HTML strings so that you don't accidentally cross-site scripting attack your users with like malicious third-party code. So a lot of libraries have a mechanism baked in to like remove dangerous stuff out of the HTML before actually rendering it. And there is a browser API in the works right now to do that. At present, if you're not using a library, you have to use something like DOM Purify to handle that for you. or use some really, really kind of onerous manual creation of elements to avoid kind of the danger there. Those are the two big ones. I did the classic Chris Ferdinandi, lost my train of thought halfway through. So Brian, I'll shut up. And if you have anything you want to respond to, I'm happy to.
No, actually, it's why I ask those big questions. It happens all the time where I go like, there's no right answer. Go for it. All right. So we have reached the point of the show where guests plug things. So is there anything that you think people should people, or maybe other people you think don't get enough attention? That's kind of the part of I like to wrap it up this way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really nice. I really like that. Yeah, great question. Yeah, two things. If you found anything that we talked about on the show interesting, or if you just disagreed with me and want to shout at me on the internet, head over to gomakethings.com/podrocket. I'm going to have a bunch of resources related to stuff that we talked about, links to any of the kind of things I mentioned, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff if you want to dig deeper in here. You can also find my contact information. So if you want to shout at me on Twitter about how wrong I was, you can do that as well. Yeah, that. And then for people I don't feel that get enough attention, I actually really like that question. I've never had anyone mention that before. I would love to direct people to Stephanie Eccles over at moderncss.dev. She also has another really awesome, super useful tool called Small CSS at smolcss.dev. So much like I spend a lot of time talking about how much JavaScript has evolved over the years and how much you can do just what the browser gives you out of the box, Stephanie does the same thing for CSS. I love CSS, but am not super great at it. And so I find myself going to Stephanie's sites to copy paste stuff from her cheat sheets all the time. Just an amazing resource for all things modern CSS related. So if you haven't heard of her yet and you want to learn more about how to write awesome CSS, I would recommend giving her stuff a look.
Very cool. We'll put all that stuff in our show notes as well if you're in the car or outside for some reason. But that was a joke, just didn't work. Chris, a pleasure having you on.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Cool. See ya.